Hi everyone, it is Ms. White here to talk to you about Simone de Beauvoir's reading from the VCE Unit Reader today. So I'm sorry if you can hear my air conditioner in the background. It's a warm day, but hopefully the computer drowns it out. So we've got six extracts from Simone de Beauvoir to read. I'm going to talk you through my own annotations of the VAPS reader and read the reading aloud. So if you have the VAPS reader, we're actually starting on page 41 because the first little section just gives you some background information and crosses out the start of the reading. We're starting from section 2, personal freedom and others. So I will disappear. Please enjoy the video and I hope it helps. So let's go across to my own annotations. So we're starting section 2, personal freedom and others. And you're going to be annotating most of this according to authenticity and freedom. There are a couple of overlaps with some of the other key guiding questions, but I'd say for the most part, most of you will be studying de Beauvoir in as part of authenticity. And a lot of comparisons, I believe, you'll start to make with Nietzsche if you're following a similar route to what my class is doing. So let's begin reading. Man's unhappiness, says Descartes, is due to his having first been a child. Interesting statement. So we've got man's unhappiness, says Descartes, is due to his having first been a child. People are unhappy because they were children originally, and she's going to explain that in more detail. I probably should have said to us to start as well, de Beauvoir, French philosopher, very, very, very famous French philosopher, and very famous feminist. So very interesting to be reading her work. Okay, let's find out what she means by having first been a child. And indeed, the unfortunate choices which most men make can only be explained by the fact they have taken place on the basis of childhood. And I think most of you would agree with that a lot of the choices we make are based on what has happened to us in childhood. Our unfortunate choices come from our childhood. The child's situation is characterized by his finding himself cast into a universe which he has not helped to establish, which has been fashioned without him, and which appears to him as an absolute to which he can only submit. In his eyes, human inventions, words, customs, and values are given facts, as inevitable as the sky and the trees. This means that the world in which he lives is a serious world, since the characteristic of the spirit of seriousness is to consider values as ready-made things. That does not mean that the child himself is serious. Okay, so to recap what has happened here. So she's saying that well, children are just born, right? And then in their eyes, all of these things like human inventions, cars, the cot, the TV, the words we use, the customs we follow, the values that we have, they're just factual. And it's not until we get older that we start to realize that these things are actually invented by humans or come up by or definitely heavily influenced by humans. They just are trying to learn them as if they are facts. And this, she says, makes the characteristic, it is characteristic of seriousness because the serious world is one where values are ready-made things. And I want you to think about whether you consider values to be ready-made or whether they are something that is perhaps more relative. That does not mean that the child himself is serious. On the contrary, he's allowed to play, to expend his existence freely. In his child's circle, he feels that he can passionately pursue and joyfully attain goals which he has set up for himself. But if he fulfills this experience in all tranquility, it is precisely because the domain open to his subjectivity seems insignificant and puerile in his own eyes. He feels himself happily irresponsible. The real world is that of adults, where he is allowed only to respect and obey. The naive victim of the mirage for of the four others, he believes in being of his parents and teachers. So we've got the man-made customs, but he's allowed to play, he's allowed to have this experience, he's allowed to feel happily irresponsible. And I'm thinking at your age, you're probably getting to the point now where you're like, oh my goodness, I can't be happily irresponsible anymore. I'm 18, I have to vote, I have to make all these decisions. Some of you might be starting to pay board at home, and perhaps um, it's not as happily irresponsible as you once were. So the real world is that of adults, and the real world is what he respects, or the child we respect and obey. The naive victim of the mirage of the four others, he believes in the being of his parents and teachers. They're the ones who make all the decisions. He takes them for the divinities which they vainly try to be, and whose appearance they like to borrow before his ingenuous eyes. So often when we're little, we see our parents and teachers as perfect and divine, even almost godlike. They make these decisions and they try and be these perfect people, but we know that they are not perhaps as perfect as we would like them to be. Rewards, punishments, prizes, words of praise or blame instill in him, the child, the conviction that there exist a good and evil, which, like the sun and moon, exist as ends in themselves. So the adults in our lives, or the adults in the child's life, make us believe in good and evil and think that it's factual in the same way that the sun and moon are factual. But we know that there is a difference. If we were to think about all the different types of facts there are, there isn't the type of fact that murder is wrong is very different to the fact there is a sun in the sky. One of them we can prove with a visual stimulus, whereas murder is wrong. It's more of a value, a moral. And however, Beauvoir is making the point here that as children, we don't think that deeply about it. We think that the values are just factual, like the same types of facts. And it's as we get older that we realize that we have that moment that actually these are values. Perhaps the murder one isn't a very good example. Perhaps we should say like stealing is wrong, or something that that perhaps a child might even argue with, that it's wrong to not go to bed on time. They just see them as facts that the adults are upholding as opposed to values. Okay. In his universe, the child's universe of definite and substantial things, beneath the sovereign eyes of grown-up persons, he thinks that he too has an in a definite and substantial way. He is a good little boy or a scamp. He enjoys being it. If something deep inside him belies, which means fails to give the true impression, belies his conviction, he conceals this imperfection. He consoles himself for an inconsistency which he attributes to his young age by pinning his hopes on the future. Later on, he too will become a big, imposing statue. While waiting, he plays at being a saint, a hero, a gutter snipe. He feels himself like those models whose images are sketched out in his books in broad, unequivocal strokes: explorer, brigand, sister of charity. This game of being serious can take on such an importance in the child's life that he himself actually becomes serious. We know such children who are caricatures of adults. Even when the joy of existing is strongest, when the child abandons himself to it, he feels himself protected against the risk of existence by the ceiling which human generations have built over his head. And it is by virtue of this that the child's condition, although it can be unhappy in other respects, is metaphysically privileged. Normally, the child escapes the anguish of freedom. He can, if he likes, be recalcitrant, which means uncooperative with authority. Lazy, his whims and his faults concern only him. They do not weigh upon the earth. They cannot make a dent in the serene order of the world which existed before him. Without him, where he is in a state of security by virtue of his very insignificance, he can do with impunity whatever he likes. He knows that nothing can ever happen through him. Everything is already given. His acts engage nothing, not even himself. And so we've got really the drawing out of what a big difference there is between an adult life and a child's life. And we do sometimes even see children who are caricatures of adults. They're thinking too seriously, perhaps, instead of enjoying being able to play around with different ideas and different interact with the world in a less serious way. But he feels protected by the adults. Most of them do. Even when the joy of existing is strongest, when the child abandons himself to it, he feels himself protected against the risk of existence by the ceiling which human generations have built over his head. So building those different value systems, those different ideas over his head, he's protected by that. But we have this difference between serious and playful people, that there are the serious people who look at everything like the values that she's talked about above as, what's the exact word she uses? Values as ready-made things. But I guess the main thing from this excerpt is that there is a big difference between the world of the child and the world of the adult. So that brings us on to our second excerpt. That was a very short excerpt, wasn't it? So let's see what she has to say next. The fact is that it is very rare for the infantile world to maintain itself beyond adolescence. So we can't have this sort of world that she's described earlier beyond adolescence. So I'm sorry for you VCE students who are probably moving out of this time now. From childhood on, flaws begin to be revealed in it. With astonishment, revolt, and disrespect, the child little by little asks himself, why must I act that way? What good is it? And what will happen if I act in another way? And you guys can probably remember some times where you've actually thought through, okay, why is this the rule though? Why are these the values we have? Why is it wrong to steal? And we see children rebelling all of the time. Like, you might have had a little sibling or something that has stolen from the store, and maybe, hopefully, your parents have made your sibling return it. But we do see them starting to really question, like, why is the world like this? And what will happen if I start acting differently? He discovers his subjectivity. He discovers that of others. And I don't know if you guys have a moment where you realize that your view was different to others, but I remember distinctly thinking that, oh my goodness, my best friend doesn't know what I'm doing right now. And that was when I was in kindergarten. So I wonder if you've also had or remember a time where suddenly you've realized or become conscious of the subjectivity that other people have. And when he arrives at the age of adolescence, he begins to vacillate, which means waver between different opinions, because he notices the contradictions among adults as well as their hesitations and weaknesses. And it is a big learning curve when you realize that your parents aren't perfect. Men stop appearing as if they were gods, and at the same time, the adolescent discovers the human character of the reality about him. Language, customs, ethics, and values all have their source in these uncertain creatures. And that's a big realization too, when we realize that all of these things have come from these uncertain creatures, humans, the adults that we look up to. These have all just come from these imperfect, uncertain people. So we begin to really question. The moment has come when he too is going to be called upon to participate in their operation. One day, his acts weigh upon the earth as much as those of other men. He doesn't have that freedom of, I guess, childhood to protect him. He will have to start making choices and guide others towards the right choices. He will have to choose and decide. It is comprehensible that it is hard for him to choose. Sorry, it is hard for him to live this moment of his history, and this is doubtless the deepest reason for the crisis of adolescence. The individual must at last assume his subjectivity. So, and I think this is interesting as well, where it's got like the deepest reason for the crisis of adolescence. We know that a lot of like your teen years, hard years. You don't just automatically go from child to adult. There's this weird transition phase where we have a bit of a crisis, where we're realizing that these values have come from these imperfect people. We realize that people, our adults, our heroes aren't perfect, and really come into your own subjectivity, your own types of views. From one point of view, the collapsing of the serious world is deliverance. Although he was irresponsible, the child also felt himself defenseless before obscure powers which directed the course of things. And I like this view as well. Like, she's really thought this through very well, Beauvoir. She's gone through, well, although he was irresponsible and now he's got all of this responsibility in adulthood, the child did feel defenseless before obscure powers which directed the course of things, that there were things that he didn't have choices over. So even though now, as you guys are moving into having more responsibility and you're losing the irresponsibility of childhood, you're also losing that feeling of defenselessness against these strange rules that didn't make any sense. They start to make sense now where they've come from and why, even though they may be imperfect. But whatever the joy of this liberation, important word there, liberation, we know whenever we see that, we want to tab for freedom. But whatever joy this liberation may be, it is not without great confusion that the adolescent finds himself cast into a world which is no longer ready-made. Scary. This is probably related to Nietzsche a little bit. The world is no longer ready-made, which has to be made. He is abandoned, unjustified, the prey of freedom that is no longer chained up by anything. Is this true? Perhaps it's still chained up by some things, but not as much as when you're a child. You become freer as you become an adult. What will he do in the face of this new situation? This is the moment when he decides if what might be called the natural history of an individual, his affective complexes, etc., depend above all upon his childhood. It's important what we learn in childhood. It is adolescence which appears as the moment of moral choice. Oh, guys, you've got important times now. It's time to start making your choices now. Freedom is then revealed, and he must decide upon his attitude in the face of it. Begin to come up with how you act. What are your morals? What choices and moral code do you follow? Doubtless, this decision can always be reconsidered. You don't have to stick to the same morals you have when you're 13. But the fact is that conversions are difficult because the world reflects back upon us a choice which is confirmed through this world which it has fashioned. Thus, a more and more rigorous circle is formed from which one is more and more unlikely to escape. Therefore, the misfortune which comes to man as a result of the fact that he was a child is that his freedom was first concealed from him, and that all his life he will be nostalgic for the time when he did not know its exigencies, which means urgent needs and demands. That there is freedom that comes with adulthood, but we are nostalgic for when we didn't have freedom. Isn't that interesting? A bit of a slightly different look on freedom, I guess. We do look back on it fondly, but we do actually gain more freedom as we become adults. I guess a little bit of ignorance is bliss in this last sentence here. Let's go on to excerpt 3. So excerpt 3 begins at the start of page 44. It is in this moment of justification, a moment which extends throughout his whole adult life, that the attitude of a man is placed on a moral plane. So we start to see the moral parts of our lives. Choice and control lead to the moral part of life. The contingent spontaneity cannot be judged in the name of freedom, yet a child already arouses sympathy or antipathy, which means deep-seated aversion, Every man casts himself into the world by making himself a lack of being. He thereby contributes to reinvesting it with human signification. He discloses it. And in this movement, even the most outcast sometimes feel the joy of existing. They then manifest existence as a happiness and the world as a source of joy. But it is up to each one to make himself a lack of more or less various, profound, and rich aspects of being. So here is an important bit here. So it's talked about that we begin to have the attitude of man placed on a moral plane. It can't be judged in the name of freedom. And a man casts himself into the world by making himself a lack of being. He therefore contributes to reinvesting it with human signification. He discloses it. And sometimes feels the joy of existing. Joy of existing. This is important when we're considering the good life. How do we live a good life? So they then manifest existence as a happiness and the world as a source of joy. So they begin to see existence as happiness and world is a source of the joy. But it is up to each one to make himself, we should probably also be tabbing happiness here, actually. But it is up to each one, each person, to make him or herself a lack of more or less various, profound, and rich aspects of being. It is up to us to bring these aspects of being. What is called vitality, sensitivity, and intelligence are not ready-made qualities. We have to make those ourselves, which is absolutely terrifying when you think, okay, we have to make intelligence ourselves. It's not something that it's just ready-made. You're not just smart one day. You don't wake up and it's something you naturally have. Yes, maybe you're more predisposed to intelligence, but you don't just wake up and have a master's degree in engineering. It is something that you have to work at. So she says they're not ready-made qualities, but a way of casting oneself into the world and of disclosing being. Doubtless, everyone casts himself into it on the basis of his physiological possibilities, but the body itself is not a brute fact. It expresses our relationship to the world, and that is why it is an object of sympathy or repulsion. And, on the other hand, it determines no behavior. There is vitality only by means of free generosity. Intelligence supposes goodwill, and inversely, a man is never stupid if he adapts his language and his behavior to his capacities, and sensitivity is nothing else but the presence which is attentive to the world and to itself. The reward for these spontaneous qualities issues from the fact that they make significances and goals appear in the world. They discover reasons for existing. So we're seeing that casting self into the world where you make yourself a lack of being is what adulthood is, and that engaging with these qualities will create meaning for us, or I guess as opposed to the word meaning, because that's a little bit airy-fairy, but they discover reasons for existing. They confirm us in the pride and joy of our destiny as man. And she's been using man a lot. Of course, she means human, humankind. To the extent that they subsist in an individual, they will still arouse sympathy, even if he has made himself hateful by the meaning which he has given to his life. I have heard it said that at the Nuremberg trial, Göring, who was a German politician in World War II, exerted a certain seductive power on his judges because of the vitality which emanated from him. If we were to establish a kind of hierarchy among men, we would put those who are denuded of this living warmth, the tepidity which the gospel speaks of, as in the Christian Bible, on the lowest rung of the ladder. To exist is to make oneself a lack of being. It is to cast oneself into the world. Those who occupy themselves in restraining this original movement can be considered as submen. So she wants us to cast ourselves into the world And if we don't cast ourselves into the world to make us this lack of being, if we don't do that, if we restrain this movement, we would be submen. So here is an important term for de Beauvoir. They have eyes and ears, but from their childhood on, they make themselves blind and deaf, without love and without desire. This apathy manifests a fundamental fear in the face of existence, in the face of the risks and tensions which it implies. The subman rejects this passion, which is his human condition, the laceration and failure of that drive towards being, which always misses its goal, but which thereby is the very existence which he rejects. Such a choice immediately confirms itself, just as a bad painter, by a single movement, paints bad paintings and is satisfied with them, whereas in a work of value, the artist immediately recognizes the demand of a higher sort of work. In like fashion, the original poverty of his project exempts the subman from seeking to legitimize it. He discovers around him only an insignificant and dull world. How could this naked world arouse within him any desire to feel, to understand, to live? The less he exists, the less there is reason for him to exist, since the reasons are created only by existing. So we want to work on ourselves like a good artwork, is what she's saying. We want to make the right decisions when it comes to our values, when it comes to our choices, when it comes to how we live. Yet he exists. By the fact of transcending himself, he indicates certain goals. He circumscribes certain values, but at once effaces these uncertain shadows. His whole behavior tends toward elimination of their ends. By the incoherence of his plans, by his haphazard whims, or by his indifference, he reduces to nothingness the meaning of his surpassing. His acts are never positive choices, only flights. He cannot prevent himself from being a presence in the world. This is the subman she's talking about. But he maintains this presence on the, and sorry, there's a typo in here, I'm not sure, the something of bare facticity. However, if a man were permitted to be a brute fact, he would merge with the trees and the pebbles which are not aware they exist. We would consider these opaque lives with indifference, but the subman arouses contempt. That is, one will recognize him to be responsible for himself at the moment that one accuses him of not willing himself. The fact that no man is a datum which is passively suffered, the rejection of existence, is still another way of existing. Nobody can know the peace of the tomb while he is alive. There we have the defeat of the subman. He would like to forget himself, to be ignorant of himself, but the nothingness which is at the heart of man is also consciousness that he has of himself. So to recap, we've got this subman. She's talking about the subman, and the subman are the people who don't make themselves a lack of being. They don't cast themselves into the world. So the submen are scared, they lack desires, and they simply exist. And she thinks that this is not a worthy lifestyle. And the reason why she sort of unpacks here is that he's rejecting his existence. It's not and to her, this is not a way to exist. Well, it is a way to exist, but it's not a good way to exist. Because he doesn't have, I guess, the consciousness of himself, or he sort of refuses to have consciousness of himself. He just exists. He doesn't live. He doesn't move forward, doesn't do anything. He may as well merge with the trees and pebbles that are not aware they exist. And to de Beauvoir, that's not a way to exist. And that feels a little bit ancient Greek based on what we've read so far. A little bit there. Okay. His negativity is revealed positively as anguish, desire, appeal, laceration. But as for the genuine return to the positive, the subman eludes it. He is afraid of engaging himself in a project as he is afraid of being disengaged and thereby of being in a state of danger before the future in the midst of its possibilities. He's frightened. He's very, very frightened. He's thereby led to take refuge in the ready-made values of the serious world. And this is important. So he just accepts what is learnt in childhood, that these are the values, these are the ready-made things that are just true, instead of making his own choices, discovering his own values and coming up with them himself. He will proclaim certain opinions. He will take shelter behind a label. And to hide his indifference, he will readily abandon himself to verbal outbursts or even physical violence. One day a monarchist, the next day an anarchist. He is more readily anti-Semitic, anti-clerical, or anti-republican. Thus, though we have defined him as a denial and a flight, the subman is not a harmless creature. He realizes himself in the world as a blind, uncontrolled force which anybody can get control of. And this bit is quite different because a lot of you, I bet, are thinking now, okay, Nietzsche, this sort of sounds like the herd. And Nietzsche's whole thing is that the herd is rendered harmless. But de Beauvoir is saying here that her subman, so it's important to realize that there is a difference between the subman and the herd who just blindly follow values. The subman is not harmless because he can hide behind these different labels, things like anarchist, anti-Semitic, anti-clerical, anti-republican. He can use those, and therefore he isn't harmless. He can still hurt people because he is an uncontrolled force. As a blind, uncontrolled force which anybody can get control of. So he's not harmless. Big difference when you start, and this is an error that I can see or foresee a lot of students making when they start to compare de Beauvoir and Nietzsche. So if I was you, I would start this and put like a Nietzsche or write Nietzsche there so that you know to come back. Here is a big difference between their two views. In lynchings, in pogroms, in all the great bloody movements organized by fanaticism of seriousness and passion, movements where there is no risk, those who do the actual dirty work are recruited from among the submen. That is why every man who wills himself free within a human world fashioned by free men will also be disgusted by the subman. So we need to be free so that we don't fall into being recruited to do these dirty work of these crazy movements. We need to be free in our choices and what we think, or what our values are. So hopefully you've tabbed freedom here, of course. Free men will be so disgusted by the submen. Ethics is the triumph of freedom over facticity, which is quality of being fact, and the subman feels only the facticity of his existence. Instead of aggrandizing the reign of the human, he doesn't look after, he doesn't recognize the reign of the human, what we have. He opposes his inner resistance to the projects of other men. No project has meaning in the world disclosed by such an existence. Man is defined as a wild flight. The world about him is bare and incoherent. Nothing ever happens. Nothing merits desire or effort. The subman makes his way across a world deprived of meaning towards a death which merely confirms his long negation of himself. The only thing revealed in this experience is the absurd facticity of an existence which remains forever unjustified. He remains forever unjustified if he has not known how to justify itself. The subman experiences the desert of the world in his boredom. Essentially, don't be a subman. You want to have meaning in your life because meaning's important, and you do that by not being a subman. Okay, let's move on to the next excerpt. I believe we're up to 4. So this is 4, 5, 6. Yes, we are up to number 4. All right. So number 4, excerpt 4, begins on page 46 of the VAPS reader, if that is the one you are using. So, often the young man who has not, like the subman, first rejected existence, so that these questions are not even raised, is nevertheless frightened of having to answer them. Young people are still frightened and may appear to be submen because they're still in that early stage, but they haven't rejected existence yet. After a more or less long crisis, either he turns back toward the world of his parents and teachers, or he adheres to the values which are new but seem to him just as sure. Instead of assuming an affectivity which would throw him dangerously beyond himself, he represses it. Liquidation, in its classic form of transference and sublimation, is the passage from the affective to the serious in the propitious shadow of dishonesty. The thing that matters to the serious man is not so much the nature of the object which he prefers to himself, but rather the fact of being able to lose himself in it. So much so that the movement toward the object is, in fact, through his arbitrary actile, most radical assertion of subjectivity, to believe for belief's sake, to will for will's sake, detaching transcendence from its end, to realize one's freedom in its empty and absurd form of freedom of indifference. So, again, feeling similar to Nietzsche, but different, discovering our own values. The young man is starting to do that. He is not rejected existence yet. And we want the young man to believe for belief's sake, to will for will's sake, find out that subjectivity. The serious man's dishonesty issues from his being obliged ceaselessly to renew the denial of this freedom. He chooses to live in an infantile world, so childish world, but to the child the values are really given. The serious man must mask the movement by which he gives them to himself, like the mythomaniac, someone who lies a lot, while reading a love letter pretends to forget that she has sent it to herself. We have already pointed out that certain adults can live in the universe of the serious in all honesty. For example, those who are denied all instruments of escape, those who are enslaved or who are mystified, the less economic and social circumstances allow an individual to act upon the world, the more this world appears to him as given. So we're starting to have some more reasoning happening. I think this is more over the page, but to explain to you what my annotations say, because my handwriting can be a little bit difficult to read sometimes. So people who are not submen can still struggle to make choices. They may turn to teachers and adults, lose oneself in the object of one's goals, want to be in an infantile world or a childish world where decisions are made, but sometimes people make choices, bad choices though, for example, slavery. This is the case of women who inherit a long tradition of submission and those who are called the humble. There is often laziness and timidity in their resignation. Their honesty is not quite complete, but to the extent that it exists, their freedom remains available. It is not denied. So people in states of submission tend to this life of being humble, laziness, but are they still free? Because they can raise themselves to a moral life. So if freedom is available, they can raise themselves up. They can, in their situation of ignorant and powerless individuals, know the truth of existence and raise themselves to a properly moral life. It even happens when they turn the freedom which they have thus won against the very object of their respect. Thus, in A Doll's House, the childlike naivety of the heroine leads her to rebel against the lie of the serious. On the contrary, the man who has the necessary instruments to escape this lie, who does not want them does not want to use them consumes his freedom in denying them. He makes himself serious. He dissimulates his subjectivity under the shield of rights which emanate from the ethical universe recognized by him. He is no longer a man, but a father, a boss, a member of the Christian Church or the Communist Party. So they raise themselves up to this, the serious people. So the state of the serious man is one of denial of the reality of freedom. There is more freedom than these roles. If one denies the subjective tension of freedom, one is evidently forbidding himself universally to will freedom and indefinite movement, by virtue of the fact that he refuses to recognize that he is freely establishing the value of the end he sets up. The serious man makes himself the slave of that end. He forgets that every goal is at the same time a point of departure, and that human freedom is the ultimate, the unique end to which man should destine himself. We need to move towards freedom. And this is, I guess, very important for our key question. To what extent do freedom and authenticity, to what extent are they needed in the good life? Well, here, human freedom is the ultimate unique end of a life. He accords an absolute meaning to the epithet useful, which in turn has no more meaning if taken by itself than the words high, low, right, and left. It simply designates a relationship and requires a complement, useful for this or that. The complement itself must be put into question, and, as we shall say later on, the whole problem of action is then raised. But the serious man puts nothing into question. For the military man, the army is useful. For the colonial administrator, the highway. For the serious revolutionary, the revolution army, highway, revolution, productions being inhuman, becoming inhuman idols to which one will not hesitate to sacrifice man himself. So are we, I guess, having these things that we don't realize we're free? And if we don't realize we're free, if we don't realize that we can make our own choices, do we devote ourselves too seriously to the revolution army or the highway or the revolution or the army? What, I guess, world is this serious man getting into? Dangerous because he doesn't see value in freedom. Therefore, the serious man is dangerous. Same when we compare to Nietzsche. The serious man is dangerous. It is natural that he makes himself a tyrant, dishonestly ignoring the subjectivity of his choice. He pretends that the unconditioned value of the object is being asserted through him, and by the same token, he also ignores the value of the subjectivity and the freedom of others to such an extent that, sacrificing them to the thing, he persuades himself that what he sacrifices is nothing. The colonial administrator who has raised the highway to the stature of an idol will have no scruple about assuring its construction at the price of a great number of lives of the natives. For what value has the life of a native who is incompetent, lazy, and clumsy when it comes to building highways? So this is a good analogy here. It's like, if you're not questioning the values or the ready-made values, if you're being very serious in your life and just accepting that whatever values have come by from being a good man or being a part of the Communist Party or being a part of the Christian Church, if you're not questioning those values and where they've come from, you become very dangerous, because what will happen then is that you might do things that are actually wrong, ignoring other people for the sake of this other thing that you're idolizing, these new values. So the example they have here, that like someone who needs to build, the person in charge of building the highway, but the colonial one, he's not going to have any doubts about sacrificing the indigenous people. This was still a piece written a long time ago. They're not going to worry about sacrificing the lives of the indigenous people, because if the highway is what's so important, why would they matter? And really what he needs to do, and what the serious man needs to do, is question, why is building the highway the most important thing? The serious leads to a fanaticism which is formidable as the fanaticism of passion, is the fanaticism of the Inquisition, which does not hesitate to impose a credo. That is an internal movement by means of external constraints. It is the fanaticism of the vigilantes of America who defend morality by means of lynchings. It is the political fanaticism which empties politics of all human content and imposes the state, not individuals, but against them. So saying, don't be a serious man. Don't just pick the ready-made values that your parents told you. It's not a good life choice. You're gonna not be a great person if you do that, and you want to be a better person. You don't want to sacrifice people's lives for the sake of something someone else told you is right. Okay, let's move on to number 5, which is here. The VAPS reader gets a little bit confusing because it keeps moving between, like, it has a few typos in the Beauvoir reading, so please ignore that. And also it keeps moving between italicized and non-italics. We're back to italics again here. So she's going to talk about a nihilist here. So reminder that a nihilist is someone who thinks that life is meaningless. The fundamental fault of the nihilist is that, challenging all given values, he does not find beyond their ruin the importance of that universal absolute end which freedom itself is. So the problem of nihilists is that even when they challenge all the given values, they don't realize how important freedom is. So we can't be like, oh, everything is meaningless. And that fails to recognize the importance of freedom. It is impossible that, even in this failure, a man may nevertheless keep his taste for an existence which he originally felt as a joy. Hoping for no justification, he will nevertheless take delight in living. He will not turn aside from things which he does not believe in. He will seek a pretext in them for a gratuitous display of activity. Such a man is what is generally called an adventurer. He throws himself into his undertakings with zest, into exploration, conquest, war, speculation, love, politics, but he does not attach himself to the end at which he aims, only to his conquest. He likes action for its own sake. He finds joy in spreading through the world a freedom which remains indifferent to its content. Whether the taste for adventure appears to be based on a nihilistic despair, or whether it is born directly from the experience of the happy days of childhood, it always implies that freedom is realized as an independence in regard to the serious world, and that, on the other hand, the ambiguity of existence is felt not as a lack, but in its positive aspect. This attitude dialectically envelops nihilism's opposition to the serious and the opposition to nihilism by existence as such. But of course, the concrete history of the individual does not necessarily espouse this dialectic. By virtue of the fact that his condition is wholly present to him at each moment, and because his freedom before it is at every moment total. From the time of his adolescence, a man can define himself as an adventurer, the union of an original abundant vitality and a reflective skepticism will particularly lead to this choice. So a nihilist enjoys action for its own sake, perhaps not realizing the importance of freedom, and it leads very close to a genuinely moral attitude. It is obvious this choice is very close to a genuinely moral attitude. The adventurer does not propose to be, he deliberately makes himself a lack of being. He aims expressly at existence. Though engaged in his undertaking, he is at the same time detached from the goal. Whether he succeeds or fails, he goes right ahead, throwing himself into a new enterprise, which he will give himself with the same indifferent ardor. It is not from things that he expects the justification of his choices. Considering such behavior at the moment of its subjectivity, we see that it conforms to the requirements of ethics. And if existentialism were solipsistic, which we've got two sort of views, and the one that she's using here is just meaning selfish. And if existentialism were selfish, as generally claimed, it would have to regard the adventurer as its perfect hero. First of all, it should be noticed the adventurer's attitude is not always pure, because they're seeking fortune or glory. Behind the appearance of caprice, there are men who pursue a secret goal in utter seriousness. For example, fortune or glory. They proclaim their skepticism in regard to recognized values. They do not take politics seriously. They thereby allow themselves to be collaborationists in 41 and communists in 45. And it is true that they don't give a hang about the interests of the French people or the proletariat. They are attached to their career or to their success. This arrives me is at the not sure, sorry guys, not sure what that's supposed to say, is at the very antipodes of the spirit of adventure, because the zest for existence is then never experienced in its gratuity. It also happens that the genuine love for adventure is inextricably mixed with an attachment to the values of the serious. Cortez and the conquistadors served God and the emperor by serving their own pleasure. Adventure can also be shot through with passion. The taste for conquest is often subtly tied up with the taste for possession. Was seduction all that Don Juan liked? Did he not also like women, or was he not even looking for a woman capable of satisfying him? But even if we consider adventure in its purity, it appears to us to be satisfying only at a subjective moment, which in fact is a quite abstract moment. The adventurer always meets others along the way. The conquistador meets the Indians. The contier hacks out a path through blood and ruins. The explorer has comrades about him or soldiers under his orders. Every Don Juan is confronted with avarice. Every undertaking unfolds in a human world and affects men. What distinguishes adventure from a simple game is that the adventurer does not limit himself to asserting his existence in solitary fashion. He asserts it in relationship to other existence. He has to declare himself. Two attitudes are possible. He can become conscious of the real requirements of his own freedom, which can will itself only by destining itself to an open future, by seeking to extend itself by means of the freedom of others. Therefore, in any case, the freedom of other men must be respected, and they must be helped to free themselves. Such a law imposes limits upon action and at the same time immediately gives it a content. Beyond the rejected seriousness is found a genuine seriousness. But the man who acts in this way, whose end is the liberation of himself and others, who forces himself to respect this end through the means which he uses to attain it, no longer deserves the name of adventurer. One would not dream, for example, of applying it to a Lawrence, who was so concerned about the lives of his companions and the freedom of others, so tormented by the human problems which all action raises. One is then in the presence of a genuinely free man. So she comes to this, she looks at this example of the adventurer and she looks at some of the problems here. She looks at how they're getting pretty close, but she thinks that a worthwhile life must involve seeking openness and freedom of others, seeking freedom for yourself and for others. That needs to be the end. We can't just walk through life not having anything there. And having this freedom, having this end goal of the freedom of others, is more than just being the adventurer. And that is, I guess, a genuinely free man. Last section, we're up to excerpt 6. There is no way for a man to escape from this world. It is in this world that, avoiding the pitfalls we have just pointed out, he must realize himself morally. We need to realize ourselves morally. Freedom must project itself toward its own reality through a content whose value it establishes. An end is valid only by a return to the freedom which established it and which willed itself through this end. But this will implies that freedom is not to be engulfed in any goal, neither is it to dissipate itself vainly without aiming at a goal. It is not necessary for the subject to seek to be, but it must desire that there to be being. To will oneself free and to will that there be being are one and the same choice. To will that there be being, that being exists, are one and the same choice, the choice that makes a man himself as a presence in the world. We can neither say that the free man wants freedom in order to desire being, nor that he wants the disclosure of being by freedom. These are two aspects of a single reality, and whichever be the one under consideration, they both imply the bond of each man with all others. So we're all trapped here in this existence. We're all trapped in this way of life. So we must realize ourselves morally, and freedom should not have a set goal. Freedom should have a set goal. We don't want that. An end is valid only by return to the freedom which established it and which willed itself through this end. But this will implies that freedom is not to be engulfed in any goal, neither is it to dissipate itself vainly without aiming at a goal. It is not necessary for the subject to seek to be, it must desire that there be being. You need to desire that there be existence. To will oneself free and to will that there be being are one and the same choice. The choice that the man makes of himself as a presence in the world. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out my annotations. We want to have the bond of each man with all others. This bond does not immediately reveal itself to everybody. A young man wills himself free. He wills that there be being. This spontaneous liberality, spontaneous freedom, which casts him ardently into the world, can ally itself to which is commonly called egoism. Often the young man perceives only that aspect of his relationship to others whereby others appear as enemies. In the preface to the inner experience of Georges Batil, emphasizes very forcefully that each individual wants to be all. He sees in every other man, and particularly in those whose existence is asserted with most brilliance, a limit, a condemnation of himself. Each consciousness, says Hegel, sees the death of the other. And indeed, at every moment, others are stealing the whole world away from me. The first movement is to hate them. But this hatred is naive, and the desire immediately struggles against itself. If I were really everything, there would be nothing beside me. The world would be empty. There would be nothing to possess, and I myself would be nothing. If he is reasonable, the young man immediately understands that by taking the world away from me, others also give it to me, since the thing is given to me only by the movement which snatches it from me. To will that there be being is also to will that there be men by and for whom the world is endowed with human significance. One can reveal the world only on a basis revealed by other men. No project can be defined except by its interference with other projects. To make being be is to communicate with others by means of being. So without others, none of us would be here and there would be nothing to possess. This truth is found in another form when we say freedom cannot will itself without aiming at an open future. The end which it gives itself must be unable to be transcended by any reflection, but only the freedom of other men can extend them beyond our life. I've tried to show in Pyrrhus and Cineas that every man needs the freedom of other men, and in a sense always wants it, even though he may be a tyrant. The only thing he fails to do is assume honestly the consequences of such a wish. Only the freedom of others keeps each one of us from hardening in the absurdity of facticity. And if we are to believe the Christian myth of creation, God himself was in agreement on this point with the existentialist doctrine. In the words of an anti-fascist priest, he had such respect for man that he created them free. So everyone needs the freedom of everyone else, and that even God created man free. And that brings us to the end. This last little bit would be quite good to compare with some of Mill's views, but we have the bits further up to compare with Nietzsche. So I hope that helped you with the de Beauvoir reading. It's quite long, so I will stop yapping on now. Thank you for watching and have an